At exactly 3:47 p.m., the ground in Africa stood still, yet 3 continents trembled. No bombs fell, no tanks rolled, no earthquake struck. Only the sound of a pen sliding across paper in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, a nation once dismissed as too small, too poor, too weak, had just signed a deal worth $17 billion, not in oil, not in gold, but in gas, liquid gas buried beneath African soil, suddenly unleashed with a single signature. Within the hour, phones rang nonstop in Washington, Paris, Brussels, and London. Behind closed doors, officials rushed into emergency meetings. They were not panicking over an explosion, but something far more dangerous, a revolution written in numbers, a revolution that cut them out of the very game they had controlled for more than a century, $17 billion. Let that number echo in your mind. The largest gas deal in African history, signed not with Western oil giants, but with India, Asia, and Africa joining hands, bypassing the banks and currencies of the West. No dollars, no euros, no CFA franc, the colonial chain that tied African economies to Paris for over 50 years. This contract was inked in rupees and a brand new African currency, a direct challenge to the financial empire that has ruled energy and money since World War II. For decades, they told Burkina Faso it was impossible, too risky, too costly, too ambitious. But now, the so-called impossible has become reality, and the very capitals that once mocked this nation are trembling in fear. Beneath Burkina Faso lies 3 trillion cubic meters of gas, enough to power half of West Africa for a century. And today, for the first time, that power rests in African hands. So the question is not only about Burkina Faso, it is about the system itself. What happens when a nation once treated as a pawn suddenly flips the chessboard? What happens when the poorest in the room signs a deal that shakes the richest? If you want the truth, the Western headlines will never show you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what comes next could shake even Washington to its core. No dollars, no euros, a $17 billion gas bombshell, $17 billion. Not aid, not charity, investment. The largest gas deal ever signed on African soil. And the signature came from Ouagadougou, a city the West long dismissed as powerless. Here is what the deal really means. For decades, multinational giants, Shell, Total, Exxon, studied Burkina Faso's soil. They mapped the Tano Basin and the Volta Basin. They knew the numbers: 3 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, worth over $200 billion at market price. But they always told the same story: too hard, too expensive, too risky. What they truly meant was too much power for Africans, because natural gas is not like oil. You cannot just drill it, load it into barrels, and ship it out. To use it, you must build massive liquefaction plants, pipelines, cooling systems, and specialized shipping terminals. That requires billions in infrastructure, billions in long-term commitment, and billions in technology. For years, the West refused to bring that investment to Burkina Faso. They wanted the gas cheap, raw, unprocessed, so they could take it abroad, refine it, and sell it back as liquid gold. India broke the pattern. India came not with empty promises, but with blueprints. Their proposal was not to take, but to build. Not to strip Burkina Faso's wealth, but to transform it on Burkinabe soil. $7 billion will go into state-of-the-art gas plants, giant steel cities rising from the ground, staffed not by foreign bosses, but by thousands of Burkinabe workers. $4 billion will lay pipelines, not just exporting energy, but creating an internal grid to electrify every village, every factory, every school across the nation. $3 billion will construct modern ports, proof that being landlocked no longer means helpless. $2 billion will fund training, sending Indian experts into classrooms and Burkina Faso youth into workshops, creating the next generation of African energy engineers. And $1 billion will build roads, housing, and communications, ensuring the wealth does not sit in bank accounts, but flows into everyday life. This is not just economics. This is revolution. Walk through Bobo Dioulasso today, and you see women cooking over open fires that poison their lungs. In Koudougou, welders work with noisy generators that eat more fuel than they produce. In Kaya, children bend over candlelight to finish homework. With this deal, that reality begins to change. Gas stoves in homes, steady electricity in classrooms, hospitals that never lose power in the middle of surgery. Energy is not just power, it is freedom, it is dignity, it is life. And here is the detail that made Washington truly panic. This entire deal bypasses the Western banking system. No dollars, no euros, no CFA franc. The contract is written in rupees and a new West African currency designed to free the region from French financial control. For over 60 years, every drop of oil, every ounce of gold, every ton of minerals leaving Africa has been priced in dollars. This forced African nations to hold dollars, borrow in dollars, and suffer when American policy shifted. But now, Africa is telling the world, we will trade in our currency, with our partners, on our terms. That is why this is not just a gas deal, it is a declaration of independence. It signals to every African nation, you do not need the IMF, you do not need the World Bank, you do not need Paris to approve your development. You need partners who invest, not colonize. And for the first time, that door has been opened. But revolutions create enemies. Western capitals are already working to sabotage. Pressure on Ghana and Togo to refuse port access. Sudden environmental concerns raised in international media, the same media that ignored oil spills in Nigeria and uranium waste in Niger. French energy companies, who called Burkina's gas worthless 2 years ago, now return with desperate offers. The panic is clear. The balance has shifted. So I ask you this. If a country the world called powerless can shock Washington with one signature, what happens when the rest of Africa follows? And if you want to see how this story unfolds, how far this revolution goes, make sure you subscribe right now, because what comes next could shake the very foundation of America's global power. When Washington panics, the deal that set off global alarm. The ink had barely dried on the $17 billion gas deal when the real earthquake struck, not under African soil, but in the halls of power across the globe. Within hours, officials in Washington, Paris, and Brussels were scrambling, their carefully constructed order suddenly threatened by a nation they once called irrelevant. Newsrooms that rarely uttered the words Burkina Faso suddenly lit up with breaking reports. Emergency meetings convened in European capitals, and across Africa, whispers turned to roars. Could this be the moment the continent breaks free from financial chains? But let us step back. Why did this deal ignite such fury? The answer lies not only in money, but in memory. For generations, Africa's wealth was dug, drained, and shipped away, leaving behind poverty and dependence. Ancestors were buried in colonial mines while their gold and oil fueled European prosperity. Children studied by candlelight while foreign corporations claimed the continent had nothing to offer. And now, suddenly, the tables turned. A nation written off as powerless had signed a contract that gave it the keys to 3 trillion cubic meters of gas. It was not just a business deal, it was a statement. Africa would no longer wait for permission. The emotional weight inside Burkina Faso was overwhelming. Imagine the mother in Gawa cooking on a clean gas stove instead of smoky wood. Picture the student in Kaya reading under steady electric light instead of a flickering candle. Envision the surgeon in Fada operating without fear of a blackout. For millions. This deal was not numbers on a page. It was dignity made tangible. And it was precisely this shift from desperation to self-determination that terrified the West. Because power is not only about money, it is about control. And when you lose the ability to dictate another nation's future, you lose more than influence. You lose the illusion of superiority. The backlash came swiftly. Western diplomats pressed neighboring Ghana and Togo to reconsider port agreements. The World Bank suddenly discovered funds for alternative projects designed to block Burkina's path. International media, silent for decades about oil spills in Nigeria or uranium waste in Niger, suddenly found its voice, raising alarms about the environmental risks of gas. The hypocrisy was as clear as daylight. France, once dismissive, returned with hurried offers to partner on gas projects. American envoys arrived with briefcases full of counter deals. But the truth was undeniable. Their panic revealed their weakness. For decades, they controlled Africa through scarcity, limiting access to capital, technology, and markets. They dictated the rules because Africans had nowhere else to turn. But India's rise changed the equation. China's Belt and Road opened new doors. The monopoly was broken. This was the emotional peak, a moment when ordinary Burkina Faso citizens looked at the future and saw a possibility where once there was only resignation. And it was also the point where the global order felt the tremor most acutely. Because if Burkina Faso could do it, why not Mali? Why not Niger? Why not a dozen other nations sitting on untapped resources the West once dismissed? So here's the question. If a landlocked nation once mocked as powerless can spark panic in Washington with a single signature, what happens when the entire continent follows? If you want to witness how this revolution unfolds, how far Africa can push back against centuries of control, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the aftershocks are only beginning. From candles to power plants, how 17 billion could rewrite a nation. Revolutions are not measured only in money. They are measured in lives changed. And in Burkina Faso, the ripple effects of this $17 billion gas deal are already reshaping the very fabric of society. For decades, ordinary Burkina Faso citizens were told to expect little. Power outages were a fact of life. Young people left villages in search of opportunity abroad, only to risk their lives crossing deserts and seas. Hospitals ran on shaky generators. Schools functioned with no electricity. Survival was the norm. Development felt like a distant dream. But now, the story is shifting. With massive gas plants under construction, more than 50,000 jobs will be created directly, and hundreds of thousands more indirectly. Welders, engineers, drivers, cooks, suppliers, every layer of society will feel the pull of progress. For the first time in living memory, Burkina Faso's youth will not be forced to leave. Opportunity will rise from their own soil. In Bobo Dioulasso, families once cooking on smoky wood fires will soon use clean gas. In Koudougou, workshops will have steady electricity instead of noisy generators. In Ouagadougou, hospitals will run surgeries without fear of blackouts. And across the countryside, schools will finally light up classrooms where students have struggled for generations under candlelight. But this is more than infrastructure. It is dignity. It is the moment when a country once trapped by aid dependency begins to stand on its own legs. The political consequences are just as powerful. Burkina Faso, long dismissed on the global stage, suddenly finds itself leading a regional movement. Its decision to reject the dollar and the CFA franc has sent shockwaves through West Africa. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Chad are watching closely. If Ouagadougou succeeds, they too may break free from the financial chains of Paris and Washington. This shift terrifies the old powers, because control of Africa has always rested not only on armies, but on money. The CFA franc tied African economies to French banks for decades. The dollar kept African trade dependent on American financial policy. But now, the message is clear. A new system is possible. Inside Burkina Faso, this deal also strengthens national unity. For years, divisions between rural and urban communities fueled instability. Now, with the promise of electricity reaching every village, the government can bridge that gap. Energy is not just about powering machines. It is about powering trust in the state itself. Citizens who once doubted their leaders may begin to believe in a shared future. Yet with opportunity comes responsibility. $17 billion is not only hope, it is temptation. Corruption lurks in every corner where large sums of money flow. Mismanagement could undo the dream. Rival politicians, fueled by foreign influence, may try to derail the project. And already, Western-backed media is searching for cracks to exploit. But if Burkina Faso can hold steady, this deal could ignite a broader African awakening. Imagine a corridor of gas plants stretching from Senegal to Somalia, connecting African nations not as colonies, but as equals in the global market. Imagine a new generation of African engineers, trained not to serve foreign companies, but to build for their own people. The civil and political consequences of this single deal are staggering. It is more than pipelines and contracts. It is the redefinition of a nation's destiny. So I ask you, if candles in classrooms can become electric light, if poverty can turn to power, what else can change when a nation takes control of its own future? Stay tuned and subscribe right now, because the answers could transform not only Burkina Faso, but the entire continent. Did America just lose Africa's energy war? In Washington, the deal landed like a thunderclap. For decades, American policymakers assumed Africa's resources would remain tied to the dollar. Oil, gold, uranium, cocoa, everything priced, sold, and controlled through U.S. currency and Western banks. That monopoly guaranteed not just profit, but power. Yet with one signature in Ouagadougou, the unthinkable happened. Africa found a way out. For American strategists, the panic is twofold. First, the energy shock. Natural gas is no longer a side story. It is the central pillar of the 21st century energy map. With Europe cutting ties to Russian gas, the West urgently needs alternatives. But instead of becoming Washington's fallback supplier, Burkina Faso has turned toward India. That means billions in energy trade flowing east, not west. Second, the financial earthquake. The decision to reject dollars and euros threatens the very foundation of U.S. global power, currency dominance. If African nations begin pricing gas in rupees or in their own currencies, the demand for dollars shrinks. And once that demand falters, America's ability to print money and project influence around the globe begins to crack. The gas beneath Burkina Faso may be buried in African soil, but its shockwaves are striking Wall Street. Across Europe, the reaction is equally intense. Brussels and Paris fear not only the loss of energy, but the collapse of influence. The CFA franc, long a symbol of French control, suddenly looks fragile. European companies that once dictated the terms of African trade now find themselves begging for a seat at the table. The empire of extraction is over, and the humiliation is public. Meanwhile, in Asia, the response is celebration. For India, this deal is a lifeline. Its economy is booming, its population exploding, and its hunger for energy insatiable. Dependence on the Middle East is risky. Dependence on Western-controlled markets is costly. But African gas is both closer and politically cleaner. In New Delhi, the deal is hailed as a masterstroke, securing decades of energy while forging a historic partnership with Africa. China, too, is watching carefully. While it is not part of this deal, Beijing sees the potential of a new Africa-Asia corridor that bypasses Western